The ropes hung slack across the fresh-turned earth-yellow warning boards, nailed to crooked stakes that read in hastily painted letters, "Cholera. Do not open." Late afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwood branches, scattering coins of light across the crude wooden cross that bore the name Tabitha Hale. A trash fire smoldered near the cemetery gate, sending thin spirals of smoke into the golden air that smelled of ash and decay. Wyatt knelt in the dirt before the mound. His shoulders trembled, not with cold, though the wind cut sharp across the open ground, but with something breaking inside him that had no name and no cure. He pressed his fist hard against his mouth, teeth cutting deep into his knuckles, until he tasted copper. Because if he let the sound out, it would unmake him entirely. It would prove to every white man watching from the road that he was weak, that he could be hurt, that they had taken from him the one thing he had allowed himself to want in years. His other hand rested flat on the loose earth fingers splayed wide, pressing down, as if he could push through 6 feet of soil and clay and find her there, still warm, still breathing, still real. But there was only dirt, cold and final and utterly indifferent to his grief. The pain in his broken ribs, 3 of them fractured, grinding against each other with every breath, was nothing compared to this. Physical pain had edges. It could be endured, wrapped tight, pushed through. This was different. This was an emptiness so vast it had weight pressing down on his chest until he could not draw air, could not think, could not do anything, but kneel there in the dust and try not to shatter. She had been brave. She had stood between stampeding cattle and children who were not her own. She had looked at him not with fear or pity or the careful distance white women usually kept, but with recognition, as if she saw not a savage or a tool or a curiosity, but a man, a person, someone worth trusting. And he had allowed himself against every lesson survival had beaten into him to hope. To imagine that maybe, just maybe, there could be something between them. Something real. Something that transcended the brutal arithmetic of race and power and all the lines drawn in blood across this stolen land. Now she was gone. Buried like infected trash, with no mourners, no ceremony, nothing but this crude cross and a warning to stay away. And the hope died with her strangled in his chest, leaving only the familiar weight of loss he had carried since childhood. A horse nickered on the road. Wyatt's head snapped up, every muscle tensing like a wolf scenting danger. Sheriff Hatchet Harry sat his mount 20 paces away, bandana tied across his nose and mouth, watching with eyes like winter ice. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, not threatening yet, but ready. Always ready. Wyatt slowly lowered his hand from the grave and bowed his head, making himself small, harmless, invisible, all the things a Lakota man had to become to survive in white spaces. The last thing he needed was to be caught mourning a white woman. Harry could use that against him, against Diani, against everyone he had left to protect. So he stayed there silent and still until the sheriff spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust and rode away, satisfied that the Indian knew his place. Only then did Wyatt reach into the leather pouch at his belt with shaking hands. He drew out the small bundle he had prepared before dawn, a twist of sage for purification, a few dried berries for the journey ahead, and a braid of sweetgrass no longer than his thumb. He laid it gently on the soil beside the cross, the only offering he could give, the only goodbye he was allowed. He pressed his forehead to the rough wood one last time, feeling the splinters dig into his skin, welcoming the small pain. Because it was something real, something he could name. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words in Lakota that she would never hear. I would have protected you. I would have kept you safe. I failed. Then he stood on legs that felt like water, his joints white and bloodless from how hard he had been clenching his fists, and walked away without looking back. If he looked back, he would not be able to leave. If he looked back, he would dig through that poisoned earth with his bare hands until they pulled him away or shot him dead. Behind the thick, gnarled trunk of the old cottonwood tree, Tabitha Hale pressed her back against the rough bark and watched through tears that blurred the world into watercolor. Her skin was pale as milk, her borrowed dress, plain gray wool that hung loose on her wasted frame. She pressed both hands over her mouth so hard, her teeth cut the inside of her lips, tasting blood, because the sob building in her chest was a living thing, trying to claw its way out. The sharp chemical bite of carbolic acid still clung to her hair and clothes from the frantic scrubbing Dr. Celine Moreau had done in the back room of the clinic, washing away any trace of her real identity, preparing her for this death that was not death, this burial that was theater and desperation. And the only way to keep her breathing long enough to destroy Robert Kincaid. If she stepped out now, if she called his name. The two grave diggers loading their tools into a wagon down the road would see her. Hatchet Harry might circle back, and they would all see that the woman they had just buried in a nailed-shut coffin was not Tabitha Hale, but another girl, a laundress from Copper Canyon, named Elise Martin, who had died alone of fever in the night. The smallest sound, the slightest movement would collapse the fragile lie that Dr. Moreau had risked everything to construct. So Tabitha chose silence. She watched the man she had come to love, though she had not allowed herself that word until this moment, watching him break, mourn a death that had saved her life. And she could give him nothing. No comfort, no truth. Only grief and lies, and the terrible knowledge that she was doing this to him on purpose for reasons he could not understand, watching him suffer, because it was the only way to keep him alive. Beside her, Celine's hand closed around her wrist like an iron manacle holding her back with the strength of absolute necessity. The doctor's voice was barely a whisper, her French accent thick with emotion. "Not yet, child. Not yet. He must believe it completely, or Bob will see through the deception. If Bob suspects you live, he will kill you slowly and make Wyatt watch. You know this. You know." Tabitha nodded, but the tears came anyway, silent, hot tracking through the grime on her face. When Wyatt finally mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering dusk, his back straight, despite the pain she knew he carried, she collapsed against the tree and wept soundlessly into her hands, while Celine held her and whispered desperate reassurances that neither of them quite believed. 6 weeks earlier. The memory came to her now like a current pulling her under, inevitable and merciless. The stagecoach, the rain-washed road, the wheels slipping toward the ravine. She could still feel the sickening lurch in her stomach as the coach tilted, the certainty of death rising in her throat like bile. Then the man running down the ridge fast, controlled, moving like water over stone, like something wild that had learned to survive in a world built to break it. A stagecoach had rattled along a washed-out track, following the curve of the Copper River toward the raw frontier town called Copper Canyon. The road was little more than 2-wheel ruts, carved through red clay and sage, and the rain that had fallen the night before had turned the low places into slick, treacherous mud that sucked at the wheels. Inside, Tabitha Hale sat between an elderly woman clutching a carpetbag and a young surveyor named Lucas, who stared out the window with the haunted look of a man carrying guilt he could not name. She was 24 years old, educated at a girls' academy in Philadelphia, where she had learned French and literature and watercolor painting, useless skills for survival, as it turned out. She wore a traveling dress that had once been fine, but was now wrinkled and stained with 3 weeks of dust and sweat, and the particular despair of a mail-order bride, realizing too late that she had signed away her life to strangers. The letters had promised a modest farmer named John Mercer a homestead near water and a life built on honest work. The agent in Philadelphia had been smooth as oil, his office papered with maps and testimonials written in careful script. Tabitha had signed because her father's death from consumption had left debts that devoured their house like locusts, because her mother had remarried a man whose hands lingered too long on Tabitha's shoulders, because the West seemed like a door she could walk through into something new. Now she understood that some doors led only to smaller, darker rooms. The wheel hit the edge of a rain-eaten gully. The entire coach tilted with a groan of tortured wood and metal. Tabitha's shoulder slammed into the door latch hard enough to leave a bruise that would purple and yellow over the next week. The elderly woman screamed a thin, reedy sound of pure terror. The coach teetered on the brink of a 30-foot drop onto jagged rocks, where a trickle of muddy water ran not deep enough to save anyone, just deep enough to drown in. Slowly. From the ridge above, a figure moved. Fast. Purposeful. A man running downhill with the smooth, ground-eating stride of someone who had spent his entire life in rough country, who knew how to read the land and move with it instead of against it. He was Lakota. Tabitha knew that from the buckskin leggings to the long black hair tied back with leather, the economy of movement that spoke of a culture built on endurance rather than excess. He carried no gun, only a knife at his belt, and a hatchet slung across his back. He looked to be about 30 years old, lean and hard, his face marked by a scar along his jaw that caught the light like a seam in bronze. He reached the coach in seconds, took in the situation with one sweeping glance, and moved. He found a thick branch, half buried in scrub, dragged it free and jammed it under the sinking wheel with the precision of someone who understood leverage and weight distribution instinctively. Then he threw his full weight onto the makeshift brace muscles, cording in his arms and shoulders, and shouted at Lucas and the Mexican vaquero, dozing in the corner, "Push now." They obeyed without question. Something in his voice carried authority that transcended language barriers, the kind of command that comes from leading men in life-or-death situations. They shoved rocks into the gap under the wheels while Tabitha, moving on instinct, grabbed smaller stones and wedged them into place. Her hands scraped raw against rough edges, her dress soaked through with mud. But she kept working, kept moving, because stopping meant dying. The coach lurched, groaned, and finally rolled forward onto solid ground with a shudder that rattled teeth. Silence. Then the elderly woman began to sob with relief. Tabitha straightened slowly, breathing hard, and looked at the man who had saved them. He stepped back from the branch, wiping dirt from his hands with deliberate care. Their eyes met. His gaze was calm, assessing not cold, but careful in the way of people who have learned that carelessness kills. She saw intelligence there and something else she could not quite name. Recognition, perhaps, as if he saw her not as a fragile Eastern lady to be protected or pitied, but as someone who had sense enough to help instead of screaming uselessly. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "You saved our lives." He inclined his head once, a small, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement, without false modesty. "The road is dangerous after rain. You should go carefully." His English was good, though accented each word chosen with precision. She wanted to ask his name, wanted to offer him something in return, money, food, anything. But he turned and walked back up the ridge before she could speak again, disappearing over the crest with the same fluid efficiency he had shown arriving. Lucas wiped sweat from his forehead with shaking hands. "We should move before the road gets worse." The vaquero crossed himself and muttered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. Tabitha climbed back into the coach, her hands still trembling with delayed shock. She folded them in her lap and stared out the window as the driver cracked the reins. She did not know the name of the man who had saved her. She did not know if she would ever see him again. But she remembered his eyes, and she could not shake the feeling that something important had just begun, something that would change everything, though she could not yet see its shape. Copper Canyon was not a town so much as a wound in the earth, a collection of raw plank buildings squatting in the dust along the river, like scabs on sun-baked skin. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the general store, and Tabitha stepped down into heat that pressed against her face like a flat iron. She was supposed to meet her intended husband here. The contract had specified the date and place with the precision of a legal document, which should have been her first warning. She smoothed her dress with hands that would not quite stop shaking and waited. A man walked up the wooden steps. Thick-necked, broad-shouldered, wearing a vest over a collarless shirt and boots, polished to a dull shine despite the pervasive dust. His nose had been broken badly at some point and set wrong, giving his face a lopsided, unbalanced look that might have been comical if not for his eyes pale and flat, as river stones devoid of warmth or humor or anything resembling human kindness. Miss Tabitha Hale. His voice was smooth as oil floating on dirty water. Yes. Robert Kincaid. Folks call me Broken Nose Bob. He tapped the crooked bridge with one thick finger, grinning as if his disfigurement were a point of pride. Welcome to Copper Canyon. He offered his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm enough to hurt, lingering a heartbeat too long while his thumb pressed against her wrist as if testing her pulse. Beside him stood a leaner man, with a tarnished badge pinned to his vest. His face was narrow as a hatchet blade, his eyes the color of winter sky before snow, empty of everything except calculation. A bandana hung loose around his neck, and a revolver rode low on his hip, and the leather holster worn smooth from constant use. "This here's Sheriff Harry," Bob said. "He keeps things civilized around here." Harry tipped his hat. "Ma'am." His voice was flat as a grave marker. Tabitha forced herself to meet Bob's gaze. "The letters said I would be meeting a farmer named John Mercer. They said nothing about you, Mr. Kincaid." Bob's grin widened, showing teeth too white and even to be natural. "Ah, yes, poor John. Worked for me, leased a parcel of good land. Solid man. Unfortunately, he passed last winter. Pneumonia took him quick when the cold settled in. Happens out here when folks don't have sense enough to come inside." He paused, letting that sink in like a knife between ribs. "I bought his claim from his kin back east, seeing as he owed me considerable money. That includes the contract he arranged with the marriage agency. Everything legal and proper, all filed with the territorial office." The cold that had started in Tabitha's stomach spread through her chest like frost. "I don't understand. I was to marry John Mercer, not you." "Oh, I'm not asking you to marry me, Miss Hale." Bob's smile never wavered. "I prefer my freedom. But facts are facts. The ticket west cost money. The trunk of clothes cost money. Every meal you ate on that journey cost money. Money John owed me when he died. Now that debt passes to you legal and binding under territorial law. Until you work it off, you belong to me. Room and board provided fair wages in company script. Once the account's settled, you're free to go wherever you please." That's not what the contract said. The contract said you'd marry a man who owned land near Copper Canyon and work alongside him. John's dead. I own his land now. I own his debts. I own his contracts. Bob gestured toward the wagon waiting in the street. "Now you can argue with me here in the street where everyone can watch, or you can get in the wagon and I'll show you where you'll be working. Your choice, Miss Hale. But choose quick. I'm a patient man, but I got business to attend to." Tabitha looked at the sheriff. "Is this legal?" Harry's expression did not change. "Man buys a claim, he buys what comes with it. That's frontier law, ma'am, simple as that." She wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to demand proof, to see documents, to find someone, anyone who would listen and help. But she was alone 3 weeks from Philadelphia, in a town where the only law stood beside the man making the claim. She had no money, no friends, no way back east, even if she could find passage. The door had closed behind her. There was only forward now through whatever darkness waited. She picked up her trunk. "Let's go." Bob's smile widened until it split his face like a crack. "Smart girl. You'll do just fine out here." The wagon climbed into high prairie, following ruts worn deep by years of passage. After an hour, they forded a river shallow, now sluggish, barely reaching the wheel hubs. On the near bank, men swarmed over a rough structure of timber and stone that looked like the skeleton of something monstrous trying to rise from the earth. A dam. On the far bank, Lakota families stood watching with folded arms and faces carved from granite. Among them, Tabitha glimpsed the man from the ridge. He stood beside an older man with gray braids and a young girl, perhaps 14, whose eyes tracked the wagon with undisguised hostility. Bob twisted in his seat to point at the construction pride thick in his voice. "That's my crib dam. Engineering marvel, really. Once it's finished, I'll control every drop of water that flows through this valley. Every single drop. Any Indian camp that wants water will deal with me, first cash labor or land. Their choice. Or they can pack up and leave." He paused, then added with casual cruelty, "Most'll leave." Lucas, the surveyor from the stagecoach, stood waist-deep in the river, taking measurements with a surveyor's level. He looked up as the wagon passed, and Tabitha saw something flicker across his face, shame maybe, or guilt eating at him from the inside. They continued climbing. After another hour, the ranch appeared like a scar on the grassland corrals, barns, bunkhouses, arranged around a main house built of logs, chinked with mud. Cattle grazed in the distance, and riders moved along fence lines with the casual efficiency of men who had done this work so many times it had become reflex. Bob stopped the wagon in front of a long, low bunkhouse. "This is yours. Meals at dawn and dusk. You'll work kitchen and laundry. Questions go to the other girls. They'll teach you quick enough." Tabitha climbed down on stiff legs. Bob drove away without another word, whistling a tuneless melody that raised the hair on the back of her neck. She stood alone in the dust, holding her trunk, staring at the unpainted door hanging crooked on its hinges. It opened before she could knock. A woman stepped out, Mexican, middle-aged, with eyes that had seen too much and a face that had learned not to show it. Flour dusted her apron. "Come on, I'll show you where to put your things." Inside the bunkhouse was crowded and dim-lit only by a single grimy window. Narrow bunks lined the walls. Women sat on sagging mattresses or stood by a cast-iron stove, their faces closed and careful. Mexican women, European women with accents, Tabitha could not place a few Americans who never spoke of where they came from. The Mexican woman pointed to an empty bunk. "That one's yours? I'm Rosa. Need something, ask me. Don't need something, don't ask. Safer that way." Tabitha set her trunk down carefully. "How long have you been here?" Rosa's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, something ancient and tired. 3 years, maybe 4. Hard to track time when days all look the same. And you're still working off your debt. We all are, chica. That's the game. You work, Bob pays script, you spend script at his store. Prices high, wages low. Never quite enough. Try to leave, he says you stole from him and sends Harry after you. She lowered her voice and glanced at the door. Ask too many questions, you go downhill. Bronze Canyon mine. Girls who go there don't come back. Tabitha felt the cold spread deeper. What do you mean? Rosa looked away. Some just disappear. No grave, no letter home. Bob says they ran off. Maybe they did. She met Tabitha's eyes again. Work hard. Keep quiet. That's all you can do. That night, lying on the thin mattress that smelled of other women's sweat and fear, Tabitha stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ranch boots on wood, laughter thick with whiskey, the low rumble of men gambling in the main house. Through the thin walls, she heard a woman crying quietly, trying to muffle the sound with her pillow. She thought about the contract she had signed in Philadelphia, about the promises made in careful script, about the door that had closed behind her and the smaller, darker room she now inhabited. And she thought about the man on the ridge, the way he had moved with purpose and certainty, the way his eyes had met hers with something like recognition, as if he understood what it meant to be caught in something you could not escape, something that tightened like a noose the harder you struggled. She did not know his name, but she knew she was not the only one trapped here. And somehow, that made it both better and worse. The next morning, just after dawn, shouting erupted in the yard. Tabitha pulled on her dress and stepped outside, squinting in the harsh light. A crowd had gathered near the corral. Bob stood at the center like a ringmaster, arms folded across his chest, watching his men drag someone forward. It was the man from the ridge. His hands were bound behind his back with hemp rope that had already rubbed his wrists raw. Fresh bruises darkened his ribs and jaw. Blood trickled from a split lip, dark against bronze skin, but his face remained expressionless, carved stone, giving nothing away. Bob grinned. This here's Waya, means wolf in his savage tongue. Fitting, ain't it, slippery as a wolf, twice as dangerous. He circled the bound man slowly like a buyer examining livestock. He's going to work for me now. Tracker and guide, knows every trail, every spring, every hiding place in this valley. Going to show me exactly where to put my fences and stakes so I can own every inch of this land proper and legal. Waya said nothing. His dark eyes tracked Bob's movement without emotion, without fear. Only the cold calculation of a predator forced into captivity, waiting for the moment to bite. Bob gestured, and one of his men shoved a girl forward. She stumbled, barely caught herself. Lakota, perhaps 14 years old, with terror naked on her young face, and a rope burn circling her thin wrist like a brand. This is Diani, Waya's cousin. Her folks died of smallpox 2 winters back. He's been raising her since playing father to the little savage. Bob grabbed the girl's chin, tilting her face up roughly. She flinched, but did not pull away. If Waya refuses to guide, Diani has an accident. Simple as that. Maybe she falls off a cliff. Maybe drowns in the river. Hell, maybe she just disappears one night. Accidents happen all the time out here. Tabitha's breath caught. Her nails dug into her palms hard enough to draw blood. She looked at Waya and found him already looking back at her. Their eyes met for the second time. No gratitude now. No recognition of shared luck. Only understanding, terrible, complete, unspoken. Both of them trapped in different cages, owned by the same man. Both of them with someone they loved, being held hostage against their compliance. Well, Bob released the girl and turned back to Waya. What's it going to be, Wolf? Waya's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to Diani, then back to Bob. He nodded, one sharp, economical a surrender that tasted like ash. Bob clapped his hands together, the sound sharp as a gunshot. See easy. Get him on a horse. We got stakes to place before noon. The days that followed blurred into brutal routine. Tabitha worked from before dawn until long after dark, scrubbing pots, until her hands cracked and bled, kneading dough, until her arms screamed, hauling water from the well, until her back felt like it would snap. She barely spoke to the other women, and they barely spoke to her. Everyone had learned the same lesson: silence was safer than words. But she watched, listened, learned. Bob owned not just the ranch, but shares in the Bronze Canyon mine and controlling interest in the general store. Sheriff Harry was on his payroll, paid to look the other way when Bob broke laws or bent them past recognition. The dam was being built on land that by treaty belonged to the Lakota, but treaties were just paper, and paper burned. One evening, she saw Wyatt return from a long ride. He dismounted stiffly, one hand pressed to his ribs, his face tight with pain he refused to acknowledge. Diani ran to him, and he spoke to her quietly in Lakota, his hand resting on her shoulder with a gentleness that made Tabitha's chest ache. That night, watching from the doorway, as Wyatt and Diani disappeared into the gathering dark, Tabitha made a decision. She did not know how yet, but she was going to find a way to stop Bob Kincaid. And she was going to do it without getting Wyatt or his cousin killed. 2 weeks later, Bob ordered a cattle drive through a Lakota camp along the river. The plan was simple and vicious: stampede the herd through at dawn, scatter their belongings, terrify them off their land, and then claim it was abandoned and file for ownership. Wyatt, forced to guide, rode ahead, with a face like stone. Lucas rode beside him, muttering under his breath that the survey stakes were miles outside Bob's legal claim. Bob, overhearing, leaned close and said with a smile like broken glass, "You survey what I pay you to survey. Nothing else? Unless you want to take a long fall down a short cliff." Tabitha, carrying food to the riders, overheard everything. She saw the map Lucas had drawn, the line of the drive cutting straight through the camp. Saw families marked there, children, elders. When the herd halted on the ridge to prepare, she slipped away down a side draw. Ran, skirts tangling, stumbling over rocks, gasping for air that tasted like dust and fear. She reached the riverbank, where Lakota women washed clothes, children played in the shallows. She gasped out a warning, clumsy, desperate, barely coherent. "Cattle coming now, run. Get the children, please." The women stared for one frozen heartbeat. Then they moved like water-grabbing children, tearing down teepees with practiced efficiency, dragging belongings clear of the path. The stampede came anyway. Hooves like thunder dust, rising in choking clouds, the world reduced to noise and terror. Tabitha saw a small boy trip and fall directly in the path of the charging herd. His foot caught in roots. He screamed. She ran, grabbed his arm, hauled him toward a boulder with strength she did not know she possessed. A steer crashed past, so close, its horn slashed her sleeve, opened a line of fire across her skin. She felt its breath hot on her face, the impact of its shoulder against rock hard enough to jar her teeth. A horse wheeled beside them. Wyatt leaned down, snatched the boy up with one arm, and shouted at Tabitha, "Behind the rock, down!" A shot cracked the air. The bullet struck stone an inch above her head, sending chips flying. One grazed her cheek, a line of hot pain that drew blood. The herd thundered past. Dust settled slowly. The boy was safe in Wyatt's arms, crying into his shirt. Tabitha crouched behind the boulder, hands shaking, blood trickling down her jaw. Wyatt looked at her, did not smile, did not speak. But something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what she had risked, what it meant, what line she had just crossed that could never be uncrossed. Then he rode away, carrying the boy home. That evening, Hatchet Harry pulled Bob aside. Tabitha, dumping dishwater, heard their voices low and dangerous. One of the men saw a white woman with the Indians, wearing a dress like you give the brides. Bob's eyes narrowed to slits. "Which one?" "Didn't get a good look through the dust. But there's only one new girl fool enough to try it." Bob turned and stared at Tabitha as she walked past. She kept her face, blank eyes, down movements, calm. But she felt his gaze follow her like a knife blade tracing the line where he would cut. She was no longer just in debt. She was a traitor. And traitors did not last long in Bob Kincaid's world. 3 days later, Lucas found her behind the cookhouse. He glanced around nervously, then pulled a rolled map from inside his coat with shaking hands. "This is the legal boundary of Bob's land. His finger traced a faint pencil line. And this, a darker line cutting deep into treaty territory, is what Bob ordered me to stake. It's theft, outright theft, and I drew it because I was afraid to refuse. Tabitha stared at the map. Why tell me? Because you warned those families. You risked everything. His voice cracked. And because someone has to stop him before more people die. I don't have the courage. But maybe you do. He pressed the map into her hands and walked away, shoulders hunched under the weight of his shame. Dr. Celine Moreau came to the ranch weekly to treat injuries. She was a thin, sharp-faced woman in her 50s, with graying hair and a French accent that softened but never disappeared. She stitched the cut on Tabitha's cheek with neat precision and spoke quietly. Several of Bob's previous brides have disappeared. No death certificates, no burials, just gone. Her eyes met Tabitha's. Bob's foreman keeps a ledger in the office. Names, dates, transactions. I think it would tell us what happened to them. Can you get it? Not without being caught. But perhaps you can. Celine tied off the last stitch. Be careful, child. Bob does not just break people. He erases them. One moonless night, Wyatt picked a loud fight with a guard about Diani's rations. He shouted, shoved, drew every man's attention while Tabitha slipped through the office window. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it would crack her ribs. The ledger sat on the foreman's desk like a coiled snake. She opened it, struck a match, and began copying names. Penelope Gaines, 22, arrived March 1849, bronze June 1849. Ulrika Svensson, 19, arrived July 1849, sold Downhill Remedios Vega, 21, arrived October 1849. No record, the list went on. Women who had come west hoping for new lives, who had found only exploitation and erasure. By the late 1870s, the ledger stretched back nearly 30 years, proof that Kincaid's trade in human misery had begun when California fever first swept the territories. Footsteps outside. Tabitha's hands froze. A hand clamped around her arm. Rattler's scar-jawed cruel twisted it behind her back, hard enough to make her gasp. Caught you, little thief. Bob's going to pay me good for this. Wyatt appeared from shadow, like something that had stepped through the wall itself. His knife pressed between Rattler's ribs, just hard enough to draw blood. Let her go. His voice was calm, empty, terrifying. Or we see who Bob values more. Rattler's face twisted with rage, but he released her. This ain't over. Run, Wyatt said. They ran into darkness, into scrub and stone where the night swallowed them whole. 2 miles from the ranch, collapsed against a boulder, Tabitha handed Wyatt the paper with trembling hands. She explained what the names meant, what the entries recorded. His face remained stone, but his jaw tightened when she finished. Words on paper mean nothing to my people, but they might in a white court. He folded the paper carefully. We take away what he wants most, the water. Without the dam, he has no power. Without power, his friends abandon him. The dam. Wyatt nodded. Together. In the days that followed, Wyatt's injury worsened. He had fallen during forced work at the dam, slamming his side into rocks. The pain that had been manageable became dangerous. Every breath felt like knives grinding between his ribs. One evening on their ledge above the valley, Tabitha saw him wince trying to raise his rifle. You're hurt. I'll manage. You can't even lift that rifle. If Bob's men come, we need someone who can shoot at distance. Wyatt met her eyes. I can't do it anymore. The Lakota needs someone who can hit a target at 200 yards. That person isn't me right now. I've never fired a gun. Then you'll learn. He positioned her carefully, her back pressed against his chest, so she could brace the heavy rifle along his uninjured shoulder. His hands covered hers, showing her how to breathe, slow, deep, smooth. How to press the trigger at the bottom of the breath instead of jerking. Each shot slammed through them both. His ribs screamed. Her shoulder bruised purple. Their breaths fell into the same rhythm, pulled together by necessity and proximity, and something neither of them was ready to name. She felt the heat of his body through thin fabric, his breath warm against her ear as he murmured corrections. Elbow lower, shoulder back. Wait. Now. Not seduction, but instruction. Not romance, but survival. Yet somehow more intimate than either. Her stance widened to anchor his weight when he swayed with pain. His injured side twisted to spare her bearing it all. Their bodies adjusted to each other instinctively, learning the language of shared burden. They spent 6 evenings on that ledge. Her shoulder turned from purple to yellow. His breathing grew more labored. But slowly, painfully, she learned the rifle's rhythm. On the 7th evening, she hit a tin can at 240 yards. The clang echoed across the valley like a bell. Waya's hand rested on her shoulder, warm, solid, steady. It lingered several heartbeats longer than necessary before he stepped away, and she felt the absence like cold wind on bare skin. No words were spoken, no promises made, but something had shifted between them. Something built not on attraction, but on trust earned through sweat and pain, and the absolute necessity of keeping each other alive. Bob decided keeping Tabitha was too dangerous. He ordered her sent downhill in the next wagon, either to the mine to die slowly or to a brothel to disappear completely. But Celine moved first. She dosed Tabitha with herbs that induced sweating cramps, pallor symptoms mimicking cholera's early stages. Then she burst into Bob's house pale and frightened, declaring loudly that Tabitha showed clear signs of cholera. Bob and Harry recoiled as if she had announced plague. Cholera killed fast and spread faster. No one wanted that death. Celine demanded immediate quarantine, a locked room in her clinic, until the patient died or recovered. Bob, terrified of an outbreak killing his workforce, agreed at once. That night, another piece fell into place. A young laundress named Elise Martin died of fever in Celine's clinic. 19 years old, far from home, drowning quietly in fluid-filled lungs, with no one who loved her nearby. Celine looked at the still body, looked at Tabitha hiding in the back room, and made a choice that would save them all or damn them. She washed Elise's body with tender care, wrapped the girl's face in cloth soaked with carbolic to hide her features and mask decay, and declared her Tabitha Hale deceased from suspected cholera. She summoned Harry and 2 drunk gravediggers, made certain none got close enough to see clearly. Harry signed death papers from 6 feet away, sweating behind his bandana. Nail that coffin shut. Bury it fast. Don't let anyone near it. The coffin was sealed without anyone but Celine seeing the face inside. The grave was dug at Cottonwood, marked with ropes and warnings. Cholera. Do not open. That afternoon, word spread. The white woman who had warned the Lakota, who had stood between cattle and children, was dead, buried, like infected trash, with no mourners. Waya heard the news in town. He stood very still in the dusty street, the words not making sense. Then he mounted his horse and rode hard for the cemetery. He arrived at sunset. The fresh mound, the cross bearing her name, the warning ropes making it real, undeniable, final. He knelt in the dirt and broke. Not with sound, he had learned long ago that warriors could not afford tears, but with a silent, shaking grief that tore through him like a blade, opening him from the inside. His shoulders trembled. His breath came in ragged gasps that hurt his broken ribs. He pressed his fist to his mouth hard enough to bruise, but the pain came anyway, flooding through him until he thought he would drown. The pain in his ribs was nothing. Broken bones healed. But this was an emptiness so vast, it had weight pressing down until he could not breathe, could not think, could only kneel there and try not to shatter completely. She had been brave. She had looked at him as if he mattered, and he had allowed himself against every lesson survival had taught him to hope. Now she was gone, and hope died with her strangled in his chest, where no one could see the wound. He reached into his pouch with shaking hands and drew out his offering sageberry sweetgrass, laid it gently beside the cross, pressed his forehead to the rough wood one last time, splinters digging into his skin. Then he stood and walked away without looking back, because looking back would break what little remained of him. Behind the cottonwood tree, Tabitha watched through tears that blurred the world. She pressed both hands over her mouth so hard her teeth cut her lips, tasting blood and salt and grief. Celine's hand clamped around her wrist, holding her back with the strength of absolute necessity. If Wyatt saw her now, shock would break his careful composure. He would cry out. Someone would hear. The lie would collapse, and Bob would kill them all slowly. So she chose silence, watched him break, gave him nothing but grief and lies, because it was the only way to keep him breathing long enough to stop Bob. When he finally rode away into dusk, Tabitha collapsed against the tree and wept soundlessly, while Celine held her and whispered desperate reassurances that neither of them believed. Believing Tabitha dead, Wyatt stopped caring whether he survived. The careful man who had played Bob's game vanished, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. He refused to guide anymore, spat in Bob's face when ordered. Bob had him beaten and locked in a shed. But Wyatt did not break. At night, he slipped out and sabotaged the dam. First sawing braces underwater, then soaking powder stores, finally throwing a burning brand into stacked timber, setting it ablaze in a pillar of fire, visible for miles. During one raid, a guard spotted him. A chase erupted across wet, algae-slick logs suspended over deep water. Wyatt ran with sure-footed grace despite pain, but his foot slipped. He fell hard, his body twisting, and slammed his injured side into a submerged rock with force that drove air from his lungs and blood into his mouth. He surfaced, gasping, choking the taste of copper thick on his tongue. Dragged himself to the bank and collapsed in reeds, staring at stars, half hoping he would simply stop breathing and be done. But his body refused to surrender, even when his mind had already given up. When Celine sneaked into the Lakota camp with her medical bag, she took one look at his gray, sweat-drenched face and shook her head grimly. You will kill yourself. One of these broken ribs will puncture your lung, and you will drown in your own blood. She unwrapped filthy bandages with gentle hands. Is that what you want, to leave Diani alone? Wyatt stared at the fire, saying nothing. He did not care anymore. The woman who had given him hope was gone. All that remained was the fight. If it killed him, at least it would be over. Celine wrapped fresh bandages tight enough to support broken bones. You are a fool, but a brave fool. So I will help you anyway. Meanwhile, Lucas discovered Bob's endgame. Unable to sleep, haunted by guilt, he walked to the dam one night to check stakes. As he approached, he heard voices from the tool shed, low, secretive, dangerous. He crept close, peered through a gap in the slats. Inside, Bob and Harry stood over maps marked with crude X's. We packed dynamite here, here, and here. Bob's finger stabbed each mark. Cut a new channel that diverts the river south. When we blow the charges at dawn, water floods the main camp downstream. Teepee supplies people everything. Looks like natural disaster. Spring runoff, heavy rain, act of God. Harry grinned. Wash them out for good. Smart. Once they're gone, I file claims on every acre. The land office wants white settlers, not savages. They'll approve without blinking. Bob rolled up the map. I'll own this valley ridge to ridge. Water rights will make me richer than any gold strike. Lucas felt bile rise in his throat. He backed away slowly, one careful step at a time, until he could run. He rode to Celine's clinic in the dead of night, his horse lathered and heaving. Celine opened the door with a lamp in one hand, pistol in the other. In the back room, Tabitha sat wrapped in a borrowed shawl, gaunt and pale. Lucas stared at her, his mouth falling open. I thought they buried you. That was the plan, Celine said curtly. Now what brings you here, looking like death? Lucas told them everything. When he finished, he pulled out the survey map and a leather packet of documents, thrusting them at Tabitha with shaking hands. This packet contains Bob's partnership agreement. He structured it to avoid taxes, named the bride as surviving partner and heir. If Bob dies or is arrested, everything passes to you by law. Land, water rights, livestock, all of it. He never thought you'd survive long enough to use it. Tabitha stared at the documents, reeling. Why give me this? Because I drew the lines that will be used to justify drowning innocent people in their sleep. I can't undo that. But maybe I can help stop what's coming. His voice cracked. And because if Waya dies, thinking you abandoned him, everything you've sacrificed is for nothing. You have to warn him. You have to go. If Bob's men see me, the whole plan collapses. Then go at dawn, before they're awake, before it's too late. She rode before first light, wrapped in a cloak that hid her face across prairie still wet from night rain. The river was swollen, fast, dangerous. Her horse balked at the crossing, snorting nervously. She leaned over its neck, speaking low and steady. Easy now. You can do this. Just a little further. I know you're afraid. So am I. The animal finally obeyed, stepping into water that rose to its chest. Cold flooded through Tabitha's dress, numbing her legs. She clutched the reins with one hand, pressed the precious documents against her body with the other, praying the oilskin would hold. On the far bank, two warriors stepped from the trees, rifles raised. Tabitha threw back her hood. I need to see Waya. Now. They're going to blow the dam and flood your camp. Please, there's no time. The warriors stared, eyes wide. One lowered his rifle slowly. You are the dead woman, the one they buried. I'm not dead, but we will be if you don't take me to him. Right now. They exchanged glances, then nodded. One took her horse's bridle and led her into camp at a run. People emerged from lodges, murmuring in Lakota, confused and wary. Diani saw her first and cried out in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. They brought her to a lodge at the camp's edge. A warrior held the flap aside. Waya stepped out into gray dawn light. He was bare-chested torso wrapped in bandages, already stained with blood. His face was gaunt cheekbones, sharp beneath bronze skin, eyes hollow with pain and grief. When he saw her soaking wet, pale, unmistakably alive, he went completely still. For a long moment, neither moved. The world held its breath. Then Waya's expression changed, not to joy, not to relief, but to anger, cold, hard, terrible. You let me bury you, each word bitten off like ice. You stood there, watched me grieve, watched me break. You let me think you were dead and rotting in the ground. Tabitha took a step forward, hands raised. Waya, No. He cut her off with a slashing gesture. Do not tell me it was necessary. Do not tell me you had no choice. You had a choice. You could have sent word, found a way. But you let me suffer. You let me believe I had lost you. If you'd known I was alive, you would have come for me. Her voice broke. You would have tried to rescue me, and Bob would have killed you and Diani both. The only way to keep you safe was to let you believe the lie. The only way to stop Bob was to make him think he'd won, that I was no longer a threat. Tears streamed down her face. I hated it, every moment. But it was the only way. Wyatt stared at her chest, heaving with breaths that clearly caused him pain. The anger in his eyes warred with something else, relief, confusion, hope, trying desperately to break through layers of hurt. He took one step back, then another, as if proximity to her was dangerous. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, knuckles white. You should have trusted me. I did trust you. That's why I did it. Because I knew you would sacrifice yourself for me, and I could not let that happen. I would rather you hate me alive than love me dead. She pulled the packet from her dress and thrust it at him, water dripping from the oilskin. Bob is going to blow the dam at dawn. He's going to divert the river and drown your people. We have to stop him. That's why I came. Not to ask forgiveness. Not to explain. To warn you. She pointed to the map with shaking hands. Lucas heard them planning it. This shows where they'll place the dynamite. And these papers prove I own everything Bob built if he dies or is arrested. We can use that. We can stop this. But we have to move now. Wyatt looked at the documents and then at her face, then back. She saw the moment the anger shattered like glass, replaced by terrible, overwhelming realization. She was real. She was here. She was alive. He swayed slightly, one hand going to his bandaged ribs. You came back, he whispered. I never left. Not really. Her voice broke completely. I was always with you, even when you couldn't see me. Wyatt closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He raised one hand slowly, carefully, as if she might vanish at his touch. His fingers brushed her face, warm, solid, real. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Don't ever do that again. I won't, I swear it. He pulled her against his chest, despite the pain it must have caused, holding her tightly, his face buried in her wet hair. She wrapped her arms around him and held on, as if she would never let go. Both of them shaking. Both of them crying without shame. Both of them finally together. Around them, the camp watched in silence, witnesses to something they did not fully understand, but recognized as sacred. After a long moment, Wyatt pulled back, looked down at her, his dark eyes serious. We stopped the dam. Together. Together. They returned to their ledge one last time, but Wyatt's ribs were too damaged now for him to even stand behind her. He sat on a boulder, face gray with pain, and watched as she loaded the rifle alone. You remember? Yes. Show me. She settled into her stance, the rifle heavy, but familiar now, an extension of her will. Sighted on a tin can 400 yards distant. Breathed slow and deep. Let air out smooth. Pressed the trigger at the bottom of the breath. The rifle kicked. The can flew off the post with a sharp clang. Wyatt nodded, something like pride flickering in his exhausted eyes. Good. Now we finish this. Dawn came cold and gray to the dam. Low clouds clung to the slopes. The air smelled of rain and mud and the sharp chemical bite of black powder. Bob's crew swarmed the site, men stacking crates of dynamite in a timber shed, running fuses along the diversion channel like black snakes. At least 15 men visible, moving with hurried purpose. Harry oversaw it all, revolver loose in his holster, eyes scanning ridges for trouble. Hidden in boulders above Wyatt, Tabitha, Deani, Lucas, and 5 warriors waited. Further back, Celine sat in a wagon loaded with medical supplies, her face pale but determined. Wyatt raised his hand. The signal. Tabitha steadied the rifle on smooth stone, sighted on the lantern above the dynamite shed, and squeezed. The lantern exploded. Flames licked up the shed's side with terrifying speed. Warriors opened fire shots carefully placed to wound and pin, not kill. They wanted chaos, not massacre. Harry bellowed orders. Return fire, find them, get that fire under control. Bob's men fired blindly uphill. Bullets ricocheted off rocks with sharp whines. Wyatt, unable to hold a rifle steady for long, used a short carbine braced against his hip, firing only when necessary. Tabitha reloaded and fired again, hitting a man carrying fuse. He screamed, dropped it, ran for cover. The shed burned, black smoke pouring skyward. Men scrambled with buckets, but the fire spread too fast. Rattler, face twisted with rage, grabbed lit fuse and bundled dynamite. I'll blow it myself. Let the river take them all. He sprinted toward the main stack at the critical point. Lucas, closer than the others, saw what would happen. If those crates exploded there, the blast would collapse the hillside, burying everyone, Lakota and white alike, under tons of rock and earth. He broke from cover and ran. Wyatt shouted, "Lucas, get clear, run." But Lucas did not run. He slammed into Rattler with all his weight. They went down hard. Lucas grabbed the burning fuse, his hands blistering instantly, and dragged it toward a narrow rock pocket where the blast would vent upward instead of into the hill. He shoved the dynamite into the pocket. The fuse hissed shorter. Lucas threw himself flat. The world exploded. Fire and timber punched into the sky. The shock wave knocked men off their feet. Rocks rained down. The diversion channel collapsed, filling with rubble. The structure Bob had spent months building was reduced to wreckage in seconds. Lucas's body was hurled through the air and landed hard broken. Tabitha screamed and scrambled down the slope, heedless of bullets. She reached him, dropped to her knees. His eyes were open, staring at the smoke-dark sky. Blood trickled from his ears and nose. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Wyatt limped after her, knelt on Lucas's other side. "You saved them," Tabitha whispered, tears falling. "You saved everyone." Lucas's lips moved. She leaned close. "Couldn't. Keep drawing. Lines that killed. Had to drop. Different line." "You did," Wyatt said quietly. "You drew the line that mattered. You are a warrior. Your name will be remembered." Lucas smiled faintly, blood on his teeth. With enormous effort, he reached inside his coat and pulled out the oilskin packet original map-signed confession. Pressed it into Tabitha's hand. "Make them pay. Promise." "I promise. I swear it." Lucas's smile widened slightly. Then the light left his eyes. Celine arrived, but shook her head. Nothing to be done. She closed his eyes gently, murmuring prayer in French. The explosion had broken Bob's men. Some fled down the far slope. Others surrendered, throwing up hands, shouting they were done. But Rattler rallied the hardest men with promises and threats. "Triple wages, we can still win." They started climbing, firing as they came. Wyatt knew Tabitha was the only one who could testify in court about the women he bought and sold like freight, the fraud everything. If she died, justice died with her. He made his choice. Wyatt stepped from cover, waving arms, shouting in Lakota and English. "Over here. I'm the one you want, the wolf who broke your fences. Come and take me." He scrambled sideways along the ridge, firing to keep their focus always one desperate step ahead. Bullets tore through the air around him. One ripped his sleeve, another shattered rock at his feet. His ribs screamed, but he kept moving, kept drawing them away from Tabitha. Down by the wagons, Celine watched for 5 seconds. Then she pulled her old Navy Colt from her bag, braced it over the wagon's edge, sighted carefully on Rattler's leg, and fired. The gun roared. The bullet slammed into Rattler's thigh, shattering bone. He went down screaming. His gun discharged wildly, hitting Harry in the shoulder. The sheriff spun and fell, blood pouring between his fingers. Momentum shattered. The men who had been climbing stopped, looked at their wounded leaders, looked at each other, and broke. They scattered like birds, abandoning the fight. Bob, watching his operation collapse, felt raw terror for the first time in years. He ran for his horse, a bay gelding tied near the riverbank, and swung into the saddle, spurring hard. But greed made him turn back. He saw the leather satchel near the dam office, 5,000 in gold deeds contracts. His life's work in paper and metal. He could not leave it. Could not start over with nothing. He wheeled the horse, leaned down from the saddle to grab it. The ground gave way. Earth, weakened by explosion and saturated with water, simply collapsed beneath the horse's hooves. Bob's scream cut off as he tumbled into the fractured crib structure, timber and stone cascading after him. His leg caught between massive logs, pinning him. Water from the damaged dam surged through the new gap. It poured around Bob, rising quickly, cold, muddy, relentless. He thrashed, clawed at logs, screamed for help. But his men were gone. The water rose to his chest, his waist, his neck. Bob Kincaid drowned in the river he had tried to own, killed by the dam he had built, crushed by the timber meant to hold back water for profit. The greed that had driven him became the mechanism of his death. The water closed over his head. He was gone. Poetic justice written in mud and blood. Silence fell across the battlefield except for water rushing through broken dam and the moans of wounded men. Smoke drifted like funeral shrouds. Wyatt staggered back, face gray, as ash blood seeping through bandages. He made it 10 steps before his legs gave out. Tabitha caught him, lowered him to sit against a boulder. You could have died. So could you. He managed a faint smile. We're even. Celine moved through the aftermath, tending wounded regardless of side. She bandaged Harry without gentleness, stabilized Rattler's shattered leg just enough to keep him breathing, though her face showed she would have preferred otherwise. They wrapped Lucas's body in clean blanket with reverence, carried him to Celine's wagon. Diani placed sage on his chest, Lakota honor for warriors who died protecting the people. He was brave, Diani said in halting English. He saved us. Yes, Tabitha whispered. He did. 3 days later, Marshal Dawson arrived, a hard man who cared little for Indian rights, but much for property law and federal authority. Tabitha met him in Celine's parlor, dressed respectably, back straight, hands folded. On the table lay the evidence-copied ledger of the women he bought and sold like freight-forged survey, Lucas's confession, and the partnership contract naming her Bob's heir. Dawson read slowly, jaw tightening. If this is true, Kincaid was running a criminal enterprise violating federal anti-slavery laws. It's all true. I can testify under oath. Dawson studied her. Kincaid's dead. Legal question is who inherits? According to this contract, I do. As his legal partner, his assets pass to me. Dawson nodded. That's how I read it. Court will seize some for fines and restitution, but most land, water rights, ranch transfers to you. And the Lakota. His face hardened. Law doesn't cover that. No treaty enforcement. Best I can do is ensure you're not forced to rebuild that dam. I want it torn down completely. Dawson shrugged. You're right as owner. No one can stop you. Weeks passed. The warning ropes came down at Cottonwood. Tabitha changed the marker to read Elise Martin Laundress, age 19. She died far from home, but not forgotten. Beside it, a new stone, Lucas Bruckner, surveyor, honest man. He drew the line that mattered. Diani planted a willow there, roots pressed into soft earth with small, capable hands. Tabitha now owned what remained of Kincaid's empire. She sold grazing land in parcels to small farmers, insisting every deed include easements guaranteeing Lakota access to river crossings and hunting grounds. Not recognition of their rights, but protection harder to erase. The dam was torn down, completely dismantled beam by beam over 3 weeks. The river surged back into its old channel, running clear and fast, the way it had for thousands of years. Some ranchers grumbled she was throwing away fortune. Dawson shrugged. If an owner wants to waste water rights, that's her business. Law can't force profit. On a bluff above the river, Waya and Tabitha stood at sunset, watching light turn water to gold. His ribs had healed enough to breathe deeply without pain. He pulled out a rolled map, the copy Lucas had filed before he died. On it, the main spring feeding the river bore a label in careful script, Hail Waya Spring. He named it for us before he died, Waya said quietly. Tied our names to the land in the only language white law respects. It's not much. Doesn't give my people back what was stolen. But it's something real. Something that will last. Tabitha took the map, tears blurring her vision. He gave us this, knowing it might cost him everything. Waya placed his hand over hers, where it rested on the map palm, warm and solid. No preacher had married them. No paper could in this time and place where white women and Lakota men could not legally wed. Society would never accept them. Law would never recognize them. But the river below carried both their names carved into territorial records by a dead man's final act of defiance. Every drop that reached Waya's people did so because one woman had chosen justice over gold love, over safety. We survived, Tabitha said softly. Against everything we survived. Together. More than survived. We won what mattered most. They stood as the sun sank and stars emerged, two people from different worlds who had found each other in the worst circumstances and chosen again and again to stand together. Bound not by law or custom or society's blessing, but by something deeper, by shared survival, mutual sacrifice, the kind of love earned in blood and fire and never given freely. The river ran on below, cold and clean and free, carrying their names into the future, where no law could touch them, where no power could erase what they had built together. From ash and grief and stubborn hope. Down by the water, Diani built a small fire. Waya and Tabitha walked down from the cabin to join her. They sat together as twilight deepened to night, three people bound by water and blood and choice. Somewhere, a coyote called. Another answered. The river sang its endless song. Waya's hand found Tabitha's in the darkness, fingers lacing through hers. She squeezed back. They held on without speaking, without needing to speak. They had said everything that mattered in gunfire and grief and determination. The future was uncertain. The law was still unjust. There would be more battles, legal challenges, pressure to rebuild prejudice from those who could not accept a white woman and Lakota man building a life together. But tonight, the river ran free. The people drank freely, and two people who had every reason to surrender had chosen instead to stand and fight and live. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.